So hello, everyone. We see that most of you have joined, so I think we are ready to start our webinar. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our new webinar. And the topic is how to avoid delays in your early phase oncology trial. My name is Justina. I'm from Biomapa's business development team. And the webinar will be presented by our speakers, experts, Arturas and Vladimir. So just to give you a bit of information about the technical part. So at the end of the webinar, we will have a questions and answer session. So do not hesitate to write your question in the question and answers box, which can be found in the ribbon at the very bottom of your screen. Our experts would be happy to answer any question that you might have. And you can submit your question anytime during the webinar. So before we jump into the topic, I would like to briefly introduce our company. So Biomapas is a clinical, regulatory, pharmacovigilance, and medical information solution provider for the global life science industry. Biomapas has been on the market for more than 20 years. Currently, we are covering more than 60 countries across all Europe, CIS, and MENA regions, and a few countries in other parts of the world. The company has more than 100 customers and counts over 300 colleagues. Clinical research services are provided in more than 30 countries with focus on Central and Eastern Europe and CIS region. Biomapas provides full scope clinical services from the study planning, providing regulatory strategy, scientific advice, study planning and design services, to the kickoff of the study to startup phase, providing feasibility and site selection, submission to regulatory authorities, leading the study through execution phase, providing project and site management services, clinical monitoring, clinical safety, medical monitoring services, to the final study delivery. Our studies are conducted in all phases, and we also have our early phase unit where we conduct patient studies and healthy volunteer studies. Biomapas has a broad expertise spectrum in numerous therapeutic areas for pharmaceuticals, biologicals, and medical devices. And most of our studies are conducted in the oncology field. Our clinical experts are very experienced in that. And today, I hope that in this webinar, you will benefit from our experience. So this was a brief presentation about our company. So I will not keep you waiting anymore and giving the floor to our speaker, Vladimir.
Thank you. Thank you, Justina, and warm welcome to all attendees of today's session. And yep, I would like to start with introductions. So my name is Vladimir Mukovoshchik, and I'm the head of the project management department at Biomapas. And I have been in the clinical research industry since 2006 in a variety of roles. And I'm with Biomapas for 6 months. And my main activity is to oversee the processes, the work of the project management department, and to support project managers during their daily activities if needed. And Arturas?
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Arturas Pajera. I'm the senior project manager at Biomapas, responsible for the overall oversight and delivery of the clinical trial projects. I've been in industry now for more than 19 years, and I joined Biomapas 2.5 years ago. Thanks, Vladimir. So
thanks. Thanks so much, Arturas. So that's what we are. And can we go to the next slide and start with the agenda? Okay, thank you. So today we would like to share our experience in managing the early phase oncology trials, which have their specific, obviously, which distinguish them from other phases and from other indications. So, and you will notice definitely that most of the items we are covering they should be and could be applied to all early phases, but oncology adds some complexities, let's call it that way, that should be considered. So it's a kind of a combination. And another general thing I would like to mention on this slide is that today's meeting is mostly intended to share the practical hints of management, different activities, and from the project management perspective. So definitely we cannot cover everything, but we are project management department. So we will try to have as less of some theoretical knowledge or on the conduct of the clinical trial, but we'll try to go into the specific practical experiences that we had in our work and which we consider, which we utilize now. And the last comment before we dive into specifics is that today we are covering mostly the preparation and the setup of the clinical trial. So we want to keep this session concise and intense, and this presentation covers the study up to the point of the start of the trial. And while we will cover the recruitment and site management in some other session later. So it's really about the efficient startup and preparation. Okay, yeah, and you can see the topics, but definitely we'll hear more about them. So next slide, please. Okay, so briefly about the general specifics of the early phase, and probably the main characteristic is that this is the first time the drug is being applied to humans. So we kind of crossing this border from the theoretical estimation of how it should affect a human body to what it really does to a human. So that's definitely a very critical and important stage. And while in many cases, phase 1 trials conducted on healthy volunteers, we are here talking about oncology. So it is very, very common that oncology patients are involved from the very start in the oncology pipeline. And so the main objectives of the phase 1 trials is to assess the safety and tolerability, and mainly to determine a dose that will be used in further, like bigger trials as we move along through the program. And also pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics are being added also for this task to define the dose, to support the definition of the dose. And since it is very start of the product development and a lot of study property or drug properties are unknown at this point, it's always very common to add additional exploratory endpoints, biomarkers, genetics. So definitely sponsors or drug developers, they want to have more options, have more opportunities to see what else can be done with this drug later in the study. And since in oncology trial, we are treating not healthy volunteers, but patients, there's always a possibility to add efficacy assessment as well, because you're dealing with the patient. And experience is that, again, this opportunity is also being used, whatever the small population it is, it still might give some valuable data and support for the development. Okay, yeah, and I'm quite conscious these are standard things that industry experts knows, but I just wanted to run through them now to then connect them with the specific things that we identified during different phases of the clinical trial startup. So you may see how these general standard things affect some specific activities. Okay, and we will share them later. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and a bit more of general things also on oncology trials. So it's the second ingredient of the mix for today. And while the all indications, they have their own specifics, so you cannot deny that, but it is generally acknowledged that oncology stands out because it has a number of specifics. And one of the main reasons, the first reasons, and obvious reasons, is that oncology has leading positions in the clinical trials. So the number of trials is the highest and it grows every year. And obviously every trial starts with early phase. So there is a demand on the professionals in this area There is a competition for resources and competition for patients, which is really tough in oncology specifically. And with regards to patients, the patients, not healthy volunteers, oncology patients have their medical histories. They might have complicated conditions. They might be taking a lot of different concomitant medications. So patient safety is the big concern in this study, and it might be covered in much detail. So one thing. Another thing is that patients in oncology, they have routinely, they have very established relations with their doctors, I would say. And there's a trust between patient and the doctors. And in many cases, doctors feel responsible for their patients. So they do not really take the protocol slightly. Protocol design, they are really demanding for the protocol design because they want the best for their patients. And this obviously means that we might need a more complex study design, and the setup of safety and management and medical management is the key in this setting. And the last thing I wanted to mention on this slide is that oncology trials compared to other trials, usually, let's say about average studies, they are more prolonged. They have longer duration because of the nature. And as an average figure, again, average, there are some cases definitely of longer durations, but it is considered that oncology trial takes 18 months longer in average than other indication or average indication. So you can imagine, and this is year and a half. And obviously it's probably a year and a half, not that applicable to phase 1, but in the phase 1, you will see that also oncology phase 1 trials, they require longer duration because you need to treat the patients. The patients are in serious condition. You cannot test some hypothesis and then move forward to some other assumptions. You need to do the treatment and you need to do the safety follow-up, which is also expected to be quite prolonged. Okay, so that was all with the theory. Thanks for your patience. Next slide, please. Okay, thanks. So now we have these both ingredients reviewed, and now we need to think of what aspects of the study setup are affected and what difficulties may appear and how we will effectively manage them. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Okay, yeah, and we will start with the protocol development. So protocol development is basically the start of every trial, quite obviously, and development of the phase 1 protocol in many cases is ongoing in parallel with the refining of the whole drug development strategy. Because, obviously the drug development strategy is in general definitely prepared at the very early stage of drug development, but it's being refined, and the phase 1 is, from the clinical perspective, one of the most affected phases, while there is still a lot of options being considered by the developers, by sponsors. So it's really not uncommon to experience long discussions and changes during the protocol development. And obviously the last minute changes are also very common. So from operational perspective, and again, I'm talking now from the perspective of the project management. I'm not an expert, I'm not a medical writer. So from the project management perspective, it is important to reserve sufficient time in the protocol development. So it's not a surprise in your study timelines that you need more time and more time to prepare the protocol. But still, it's also project manager responsibility to coordinate and oversee this activity, and sometimes remind the stakeholders. And the stakeholders, protocol developers, they are normally a lot of them, and they are very scientific, they are very knowledgeable, very enthusiastic, but they are not that respective to the further operational steps and timelines. So they're trying to get the best out of the protocol, but sometimes it's project manager's task to say, we must stop here, okay? Because there are further critical activities that await, and we need the final protocol. So it's one thing that should be driven by the project manager. It's the timelines for the finalization of the protocol. So that's what I wanted to highlight for this piece. The timelines, and it's the project manager who needs to step in and say, okay, guys, this is the deadline. Okay, then the design of the protocol will definitely include multiple bioanalytical parameters, and they are the key decision makers for the dosages. And the tricky part here is to find the balance between nice to haves and the, some insufficient number of study assessments. And excesses on both sides, they may lead to a failure. So if you would like, and that's something that actually we experience sometimes, scientific people, they want to analyze this and this and this. So can we collect additional sample here, additional sample there? And you get to a point when you're collecting way too many specimens from patients. And this just simply becomes unacceptable. So this will not be accepted by patients, then the reading ICFs, investigators will not agree, ethics committee will not let your study through. So that's one side of the story. Another side is when you are too cautious, you're at the risk of just simply not collecting enough material, and the study will become a failure by design, which is also something we don't want to have. So that's also a project manager's task to oversee and coordinate and combine the knowledge and expectations from all stakeholders. And here it's very important that all stakeholders involved. So it's scientific people writing the protocol, it's medics who are assessing the safety, it's labs who doing the analysis, it's statistics who will analyze this data. So, and operations, of course. So it's like how you will practically handle this. So all these items must be combined, and there should be a realistic setup for the biomarker assessment by analytical parameters. And so again, here, project manager is not required to be an expert and say, okay, at this time point it's needed, this is not needed. But the project manager must use the common sense and must use the drive to drive the team and make sure that everyone is happy, every item is covered. So the message basically here for the project manager and the experience that they have is, do not try to save time and do not consider that you have a team of experts. They will do their work, they know it, and they are the experts. But sometimes there is a struggle with making the pieces work together. So project manager must assess, like take a common sense look, just try to see, does it work? Does all the pieces come together? And then see that the mechanisms work, get the final approvals from all stakeholders, and yeah, and then give it green light, give it go ahead. So do not hesitate to take a second look, put the puzzle together, and then move on. So do not really, the message is, do not miss this second step, additional check. Okay, and also as mentioned on the general slides, it's about the safety, and it comes from both early phase and oncology indication combination. So everyone is looking at this very closely. And we basically need during the protocol development to ensure that we can convince patients, investigators, and ethics committees that this part, the safety part, is covered to the best possible extent. So it is a first in human trial after all, so it's always a risk. Even if you have very detailed investigator brochure, low risk profile, still it is a good practice to seek advice from key opinion leaders or principal investigators if you have one identified. And usually there are some investigators when you're dealing with a phase 1 trial. So get their advice, consider them. And another option, you may want to reach out to some authorities to ask like for scientific advice. And after you have it, address it, put it in the protocol, or prepare very sound justifications why they are not included. So you can also talk to investigators or reply to ethics committee if there are queries why it's not done. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and on this slide, I just wanted to briefly run through a couple of more other considerations, which we also experience. So this is our experience. from the real life. So continuous uninterrupted provision of the drug to patients. So there will be more IMP consideration later in this presentation, but in terms of the protocol design, it is extremely important to ensure provision of the IP to patients without interruption after completing the trial. So if patients completed the trial, went through all cycles, benefits from the drug, you must ensure that patients receive these drugs further, because patients benefit from the drug. And this is something that is expected absolutely by investigators. It's expected by authorities. So you must think in advance and put this in your protocol design. And there might be different options, like give them clear indication how the patients will go in phase 2 trial, or there will be a rollover study to which patients may be rolled over and continue simply mostly on the drug. Or there might be some governmental programs that covers this topic, different options. But the thing is that you must show to investigators and to authorities that patient will not be left without the drug, because otherwise it's a bottleneck. Sites will not be accepting your protocol, or you will get rejection from authorities, etc. So definitely it's better to think of this in advance. And objectives and endpoints, basically that's what the whole study is being conducted for. So it's impossible to overestimate the importance of this part. And again, from the project management perspective, of course, you might be very experienced and have a lot of experience with this indication, with type of studies. But basically, it's not what you must do, because there are experts for this work. What you must do as a project manager, again, give it a second look, do the common sense check. And I can share with you the experience then. There was very simple mathematical error done by statistics when they designed the protocol. And it was really omitted by all the reviewers because everyone was so happy, a bit exhausted by the finalization of the protocol. But there was a project manager who just simply did some final calculations, spotted this error, and saved the protocol amendment for the company. So again, it's another reminder. Do not skip the additional check, even if you're not an expert. The common sense, as a project manager, you should have a lot of common sense. So do this, and especially if there were last-minute changes. And in most cases, there are last-minute changes, protocol phase 1. So that's always a chance of some inconsistencies being thrown in and just simply not checked by someone. Okay, so I think that's it from me on this topic, and I'll give the floor to Arturas, who will present a couple of other items to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you very much. So I would like to present a couple of topics for various items. So investigational medicinal product is the first item I wanted to discuss. It is important to highlight, though, that manufacturing and oversight of IMP is usually performed by the sponsor. Therefore, it's not that always or very rarely the CRO is directly involved, but we thought that it's still important to highlight those top 5, let's say, items which we think and we see from our practice are usually affecting the delays and the study conduct. So you can see them on the slide, is that location of investigational sites, the trial design, availability and stability of the IMP, the packaging requirements, and of course, time when to start the clinical study. So shortly about the location of clinical sites. The geographical location should be known before manufacturing IMPs as much as possible. And that is why it is important that the country selection would be thought as early as possible about, and the thorough feasibility to be done. What is essential is that the clinical supplies are manufactured based on the regulatory requirements for that region of the country. And main attention usually needs to be paid between differences of the biggest markets like US and EU. Because sometimes we still see some assumptions that something which works in the United States is very similar to what is in European Union, and in quite a few cases this is not the case. And another important thing to consider here is that for the trials which are being performed in the EU, QP person or the qualified person needs to release the IMP according to the regulation. So therefore the recommendation is that if possible, to work with a CMO, on the contracting manufacturing organization, with which there is some experience, or at least an audit has been performed by the responsible QP person. Because if it is not done in time and not realized soon enough, it usually is taking so much more time before the IMP can be produced. The trial design is of course important, and in phase 1 oncology trials, we don't speak about placebo, but other parts need to be considered as well. Availability and stability of investigational medicinal product is important in terms of that. It's not always known, that stability studies are usually conducted in concurrence or in the same time with the clinical trials. So thus a confirmed expiry date cannot be printed on the label at that time. And mostly the retest date or use by date is preferred. And the stability of drug is important factor and needs to be also considered for the packaging of the IMP. And going to the packaging requirements, the IMP package also must be defined based on the target population, study design, and available stability data. And of course, the time when to start the clinical study. Again, we sometimes see that it is underestimated, and despite as a CRO, we are not involved at the early stages for different reasons. But it might take from 5 to 9 months on average to manufacture, package, label, and release the IMP. And it's of course varies from the study, the size, the complexity, but it is very important, like in all project management, I guess, is that the cooperation should start as soon as possible. Again, usually at the sponsor side, but as a CRO, sometimes we see that this is not thought through. Again, there's not enough communication with different parties. The country selection, as I mentioned before, and site selection is not thoroughly thought through. And then the delay happens suddenly. Can we go to the next slide, please? Another 3 items which I wanted to highlight as well is the ATMPs, or as per definition, the advanced therapeutical medicinal products, defined as for human use that is based on gene, cells, or tissue engineering. Obviously, they are becoming more frequent. And the contract manufacturing organizations, especially, the ones who do it for the first time, they need to have a very good oversight to really ensure that they have all of the licenses in place, resourcing, and enough experience for the CMO and their staff. Recently, again, what we've seen is that it looked like the CMO is very experienced and everything goes very well. But when the submission time came, it was realized that, the gene therapy license was not exactly fully achieved as needed for the producing of the IMP for the trial. And the CMO needed to apply for a license, which obviously took quite a long time when they needed to go to the authorities, and that significantly delayed the start of the trial. Uncertain stability, so not exactly necessarily related to exactly the startup phase, but there is a need and awareness to be prepared for the relabeling and additional QP releases, which takes time. And another little advice about medical device studies, which is sometimes still also overseen, is that different requirements, again, mainly between United States and EU, because sometimes the sponsor is not fully aware about the specifics, and sometimes, as a simple example, it is assumed that if the certain device is certified in the United States, the same should apply for EU. And this is not the case. It needs to be really investigated as early as possible. Can we go to the next slide, please? And now coming to the independent regulatory boards and ethics committees and regulatory authority approvals and considerations to be taken into account. Overall, I guess it's very important for every study that the initial submission package would be of a very good quality, because in order to pass the initial validation and minimize the number of potential queries, because the clock stops and then you have a week, another week, and suddenly you see that the project is significantly delayed. Safety data is of key importance, and Vladimir already mentioned it for a couple of times. Also, again, wanted to highlight for this advanced therapeutic medicinal product, the timelines of the approval is significantly longer than for the traditional trials with, let's say, traditional IMPs. And in quite a few European Union countries, the standard approval timeline would be 60 days. However, it might be prolonged by up to 120 days, according to local regulations, because of this is ATMP, and experts need to be involved, subject matter experts need to be involved at the local authorities. So at the end, you might plan your study would start in 60 days after approval, but this can be prolonged up to 180 days, which is 3 times longer. And that is really still a separate thing to be noticing about the ATMPs. And another big change which is coming is the CTR, the clinical trial regulation changes in clinical trial submission and approval process, which is a centralized procedure used for the EU. It's still not fully in effect. It should come in a full effect by end of January next year. And despite it's a new system, and the purpose is really to make the process more clear and easier, and submit multiple countries in one go, let's say, but we already see some challenges with it. Like as an example, if you submit multiple countries, it's still, despite it is a centralized submission, some of the documents are global which you submit, but still the part 2 is for the documents which are based on the local requirements in the country. And if one country out of multiple countries you would like to submit at the beginning has some very peculiar and long taking task to be completed, and if you wait for it, the other country's submission might also be delayed. So then, a strategy needs to be thought of, if better to submit those easier countries or countries with not so many strict local requirements first, and then consider adding this more complicated country at the end. This is what needs to be thought about already. It looks from the first times we started to use it. And another very practical example, again, which comes after starting to use the centralized submission, is that in order to submit the investigational sites with the centralized submission, the institutions need to be registered. The institutions, I mean investigational sites themselves, they need to be registered in the EMEA system. And this is not a very smooth and quick process, especially at the beginning when no one is used for it. So there will be quite a few challenges with the CTR, but at the end, hopefully this will be a good system and will help the research. Can you please go to the next slide? Thanks. And then to finish, compensation to participants for time spent. It is important to note, that in quite a few countries, the trial participants can be compensated for their time spent. And this can really help with enrollment, especially the start of enrollment, and keep the enrollment going. So sometimes this part is skipped, and not all sponsors, let's say, know that it is an option at all at that country, and they don't even check it. But this needs to be also checked, because it really can support the enrollment, and this needs to be done together with initial submission as much as possible. Specific attention to informed consent forms. Again, this is applicable to all trials. However, we see that this is still one of the main sources of queries from the ethics committees if the informed consent form is not thought through very well. Another item is that some countries are not willing to accept early phase trials or trials with ATMPs. Of course, the list is not definite, and but from our experience, we see that some countries can be more reluctant to approve it. And same is applicable for the local ethics committees versus the central ethics committees. So we see a bit of the tendency that local ECs are more likely to reject an early phase ATMP trial than the central ethics. So if possible at all, because of course this is not always possible, if there is a opportunity to choose between sites using local ethics committees or central ethics committees, the central ethics committee should be considered. Yeah, thank you. That's it for my side. So Vladimir, I'm giving it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Arturas, and thanks for jumping to the next slide. So about vendors identification. So again, this item is directly connected to the study setup and is based on the design of the protocol. The specific thing here is that you're setting up the vendors normally for the whole duration of the drug development. So normally you define a vendor at the beginning and you use the same vendor, same approach, same methods throughout the trial. Okay, you modify them depending on the size of the trial, etc. But that's a key moment, and it's definitely critical to find and establish proper vendors and set them up also properly. And so the best approach here, again, based on our experience, is that you should define the scope of the activities to the best possible extent. So this will help to avoid misunderstandings on vendor sides and incorrect proposals sent to you and some frustration with this, etc. So it's understood that normally you don't have a protocol when you start negotiations with your vendors. But okay, just do your best. That's the advice, that's lessons learned by us. And like, if you're just simply sending a protocol or protocol synopsis to a vendor, you will get back tons of questions and one-page-long proposal, which will not be meaningful, and you will spend time on going back and forth with questions, organized calls, etc. So this is potentially unavoidable, but just try to be as specific, give as much information as you can to the vendor, and ask for to be as accurate as they can on their end. So it's just a good practice that even if it's not always possible, just do your best and put as specific request as situation allows. And so on this slide, we have a list of some standard vendors, some of them like absolutely necessary for the trials. Some are optional. They might appear in some studies due to design of patients' populations. And here I wanted to briefly stop on the central labs and data management, because they are absolutely inevitable and they are critical for the study. So, and for central labs, usually it's the time when you're setting up a method of analyzing this new drug in humans. So you have some methods from your preclinical trials, but they cannot be necessarily applied on humans. It's a different species, let's call it that way. So it takes time. It takes time to find the lab. It takes time to explain to the laboratory what you want from them. And one of the pieces that we know is that it's essential to connect preclinical laboratory with clinical laboratory. Let them speak together. They are the scientists, they know the terms, they know the conditions, the requirements. So from the project management perspective, it shouldn't be assumed that it will be organized somehow by itself. No, you have to proactively connect them, make sure that things are moving, and support this, and push if you see that something stalls, because it's a long process. It's a long process that should be started as soon as possible. So laboratory is something that you need to think of at the very beginning. And for the data management, this is another key element. And while it's more or less easier sometimes for data management to use the synopsis to get an idea of what they need to do and give you more or less accurate proposal, still it's quite important to get some specifics, to give them the number of analyses that you expect from them, at what time points you will need the data, what type of data reports you will need from them, for example, for safety review committee, if they can really meet your requirements and expectations. And another important point, when you deal with the data management, take a look at the system that they propose. What are the capabilities of the system? Is there a possibility, does it meet all your requirements? Is there a possibility to do the checks right in the system? For example, medical review. You can go with the Excel check sheets, or you may click directly in the system and save time. So again, this is always a combination of costs and properties. So the main thing is that you need to know what you want, and you need to get a clear answer and make sure that all expectations are met. So there is no frustration, no things missing, because they simply cannot be done at all. And you realize it only when your first patient already enrolled. So basically for both of these, and mainly for all vendors, it's the key. It's a bit of repetition, but the key is to have the accurate list, accurate as possible, of what you need and what you already know, and share it with vendors and get it back from them. And so for medical and safety services, we will discuss it on the next slide. And there are also other services like IXRS or maybe central assessments, whatever. The approach is the same. They're less common, so I don't want to go into details, but the approach is the same. You must know what you want from them, and you need to get the answers that you need from them as well. Okay, and another important thing here is that all systems must speak to each other. So there should be an integration. This is something that is, I would say, again, based on experience, project manager responsibility. So functional leads, they more tend to, cover their part. Okay, I know how my ECRF is running. I know how I analyze the labs. But how do you transfer the data from labs to data management? How data management gives the data to medical so they can present it to SRC. So this must be thought through, and the suggestion, advice here is, again, it's on the project manager. Always you might get some support, but it's your ultimate responsibility as a project manager to check the plans and see that everything works and speaks to each other. So there is no inconsistencies or discrepancies. And the last thing I wanted to mention on this slide, again, lessons learned, is that most vendors will not start their activities until you have the contract signed. So many of them might start some, and they should start some negotiations, some setup, but when it comes to some real work, you will need to have a contract signed. So you must keep this in your head when you're planning the timelines, when you're planning activities. If you're really stuck with defining specifications going back and forth, that may delay your study. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. And safety. Safety, it's actually the last item we wanted to cover on this presentation. It's already been discussed several times, so I don't want to repeat myself. Just a few practical things that we know is that usually in phase 1, there should be adverse events of special interest. And this is medical team's responsibility because they know they or sponsor know, let's call them weak points of the drug, the systems that affect adverse events that most serious and might affect patients. So this list should be available. From your project manager side, it's a good practice to check that there are additional procedures in the protocol that covers this. I don't know, additional assessment, echocardiography, or additional laboratory sample test is done for this particular adverse event. And it's also very good practice to have a patient materials prepared for the management, kind of a guidance for patients for the management of identification, symptoms, how to behave if you identify those symptoms for patients. So this is very good thing from the safety perspective, but it is also a good thing when you submit this to ethics and they see that you're really taking care of the safety of patients. And the setup of medical and safety oversight is also quite a big thing. And this is, again, something that we faced when there are several teams involved. Well, in most cases, there will be 2 teams, let's say, that there is a CRO team and sponsor team. And then it's kind of considered that some very important task is covered by the other team, and the other team think it's covered by the first team. But in the end, it turns out that nobody really cares about this, like taking care, and nobody's doing this. So that's project manager's task to jump in, check the medical management plan, whatever document you have, make sure all responsibilities are distributed, covered, and there is no misunderstanding between teams. So basically, you can do this or this as long as we cover everything. That is absolutely fine. And that's what we need. Okay, and then about SRC, Safety Review Committee, another interesting, I would say, item of the phase 1. You may see safety committees in different phases. At some point, most of safety committees, they turn into the data monitoring committees. So they are not that concentrated on safety, while it's still important, but they generally see how the data is progressing. But in the phase 1, it's safety first, and it's almost mandatory for most of the phase 1 trials. So for this one, routinely they are set up, or like the members of committee are identified by sponsors. So usually the expertise is being taken care of by them. But what we see is that these people, Usually they are very, very experienced. They need it everywhere. They have limited availability. And then it comes to the time of analysis, you need to really juggle the availability of the data, the timeline for conduct the trial to make, the meeting to make the decision, and their availability. So this is something to be very much conscious about and work on this setup and scheduling as early as possible. And another thing is the alignment of requirements and expectations, because again, those people that might be in a committee, they have very own experience, a lot of experience, and they did similar assessment that way, and they expect that it will be the same way in this study. And another person in this committee expected the other way. So again, this is for the project manager, but of course, there's a lot of people preparing for the committee gathering data. But again, project manager oversees and making sure that everything is aligned in advance, expectations met, and it's of course very good practice to have a mock meeting. So gather with the members, show them the structure of your slides. Of course, charter must be finalized by then. So again, just talk this through and see, okay, are we good? Are we all aligned that this is the data that you expect for the real meeting, for the decision-making meeting? Okay, if not, then you should have some time for refining the processes. So again, for SRC, my main two messages would be schedule in advance and align expectations. Okay, I think that is it. So can we go to the next slide? Yeah. And so now we have made it to the summary slide. There were all items that we covered are listed, and basically we talked about them a lot. And this is obviously not an exhaustive list, and we were not intended to have an exhaustive list because it's not possible, and we will need hours and hours, and things change in clinical trials daily, if not hourly. So it was just the intention to share some of our experience, our real life experience. And also, you might have noticed that our approach on the project management is that we do not really require project managers to be experts in the areas. It's always welcome, and sometimes you simply must dig deeper and get to detail. But our general task of our project management team is the oversight and coordination, ability to measure plans versus reality and actualize them after they agreed, and basically ensure that studies run within timelines and the budget. So thank you so much for your attention. And that's it. And now we will move to questions and answers. So let me see what we have. Okay, yeah, we have a few. So, okay, how many oncology trials your company is running? Okay, so yeah, I'll take this one. So at the moment, we are running 3 early phase oncology trials. And basically we have experience in running these trials in the past. And the intention as our company is growing, we're definitely looking forward to implementing our experience, using it, and expand our oncology portfolio. I hope that answers the question. Okay, the next one is, can your company write a protocol for us? Yeah, we have very experienced medical writing team, and that team has a history of successfully written protocols that passed the regulatory submissions and ethics submissions, and they were implemented in the real life successfully. Yep, so definitely we have this capability, and we also have a kind of established network of consultants which we ask to help us if there is some specific item we need to cover, if there's some specific request coming from the sponsor. Okay, and actually the last one that I see here, compensation to participants, is it possible for healthy subject studies only? I think, Arturas, this is something that was in your.
Yeah, I could take. Yeah, it's a good question, because I think first of all, we should not confuse the reimbursement for the patients, like travel and meals as an example. But compensation to participants is when the participants can be compensated for their time spent, because sometimes especially oncology and early phase studies are very intense, and they need to come to the clinical trial center and stay there from days, to 10 days even maybe. And it's becoming now more and more frequent that countries allow to compensate, not only reimburse for the meals and travel as an example, but as well, the participants can be compensated for their time. And it's not only for the healthy volunteers, but also for the patient studies. Of course, there are some differences between the countries, and it needs to be looked at the beginning, because some of them have very specific rules on what amount maximum can be compensated to the subject. Is it connected to the number of hours or days, etc.? But to summarize and answer the question, yes, it's also possible to the patients, not only to the healthy volunteers.
Okay, great. Thanks, Arturas. And actually, you live, you learn. This was kind of news for me. Okay, I think that's all that we have. Let me check. No new questions. So let us conclude our meetings. And before we close the call, I would like to announce next webinar from our company, which will be dedicated to the regulatory framework of drugs in Middle East, North Africa insights. That's a very interesting, specific, and rapidly developing region. So you are very welcome to join. And if you have any questions, anytime, please feel free to reach us. And on the next slide, we will see the contacts. Okay, thank you. So here are our contacts, and you can find us on our website, and we would be happy to communicate with you and address your requests. So again, thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.
For your time and for your interest. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.